Published 6:46 Eastern Standard Time, the 22nd of February 2019. Updated 10:38 Eastern Standard Time, the 22nd of February 2019. Belarus has warned that things will turn nasty if America installs new missiles in Europe. President Alexander Lukashenko said Minsk and Russia would have to think about response measures if the U.S. carries out such a deployment. It comes after Vladimir Putin said Russia is militarily ready for a Cuban Missile-style crisis if the U.S. wanted one and threatened to place hypersonic nuclear missiles on ships or submarines near American territorial waters. Addressing the possible threat to Belarus security, Lukashenko warned today that it is a catastrophe, particularly for us. Belarus has warned that things will turn nasty if America installs new missiles in Europe. President Alexander Lukashenko, left with Vladimir Putin, warned that Minsk and Russia would have to think about response measures if the U.S. carries out such a deployment. Vladimir Putin has said Russia will target weapons at the U.S. should it deploy new intermediate-range missiles in Europe following America's withdrawal from a key arms control pact. America's withdrawal from the Cold War-era Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces (INF) treaty has sparked fears of a new arms race. File picture, he added, "I am afraid that Americans will grab the fleeting opportunity and will deploy the missiles in Europe after breaking the treaty. If they do, things will turn nasty for us, too. Because together with Russia we will have to think about reciprocal measures. It is unavoidable if it happens. It would be even worse if, God forbid, the missiles got deployed in Ukraine." Yesterday, Putin said Russia is militarily ready for a Cuban Missile-style crisis if America wanted it. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962, when Moscow responded to a U.S. missile deployment in Turkey by sending ballistic missiles to Cuba, sparking a standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. More than 5 decades on, tensions are rising again over Russian fears that the United States might deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe, as a landmark Cold War-era arms control treaty unravels. Putin's comments, made to Russian media late on Wednesday, follow his warning that Moscow will match any U.S. move to deploy new missiles closer to Russia by stationing its own missiles closer to the United States or by deploying faster missiles or both. Putin detailed his warning for the first time, saying Russia could deploy hypersonic missiles on ships and submarines which could lurk outside U.S. territorial waters if Washington now moved to deploy intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe. We're talking about naval delivery vehicles, submarines or surface ships. And we can put them, given the speed and range of our missiles, in neutral waters. Plus, they are not stationary, they move and they will have to find them, Putin said, according to a Kremlin transcript. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world as close as it has ever been to nuclear war in October 1962. After America's failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, the Cuban strongman allowed the Soviet Union to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, putting the warheads in easy striking distance of most of the U.S. If Russia chose, it could launch the missiles at the U.S. before Washington had a chance to retaliate. Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. During a historic meeting a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out, America had already deployed ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey, putting them within easy striking distance of Moscow. President John F. Kennedy informed Americans during a television broadcast on October 22, 1962, that the Soviets had placed missiles on Cuba and that in retaliation, the U.S. would erect a blockade around the island to force Castro and Khrushchev to remove two missiles. He announced America would be willing to use military force if necessary to deter what was seen as a threat to national security, and the world waited with bated breath. On October 24, 1962, another key moment came when Soviet ships heading for Cuba neared the line of U.S. vessels enforcing the blockade. An attempt to breach the blockade would most likely have resulted in a military standoff, but Soviet ships backed down. A U.S. invasion forces readied itself for an invasion of Cuba but were eventually stood down. Kennedy, pictured, showed restraint by not attacking the Soviets or Cubans. A flashpoint which could have triggered all-out war was when an American reconnaissance plane was shot down on October 27, 1962. A U.S. invasion forces readied itself for an invasion of Cuba but were eventually stood down. The 35-year-old pilot of the downed plane, Major Rudolph Anderson, is considered the sole U.S. combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Throughout the tense standoff, Khrushchev and Kennedy were in contact to try to avoid any military escalation between the two superpowers. On October 26, 1962, Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy in which he offered to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for a promise by U.S. leaders not to invade Cuba. The following day, Khrushchev sent a letter proposing that the USSR would dismantle its missiles in Cuba if the Americans removed their missile installations in Turkey. Secret negotiations between Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and JFK and between his brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin led to a deal. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara said after the incident it would be the last Saturday he would ever see as tensions continued to escalate. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles in return for America pledging not to invade Cuba. The U.S. also secretly promised to remove obsolete missiles from Turkey. Both sides claimed victory as a way of putting a positive PR spin on the crisis. Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro enjoys a steak dinner while holding an impromptu press conference at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem during his visit to New York on September 23, 1960. Work it out, Mach 9, the speed of the missiles, and over 1,000 kilometers, their range. The State Department dismissed Putin's earlier warning as propaganda, saying it was designed to divert attention from what Washington alleges are Moscow's violations of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty. It referred queries about Putin's latest remarks to the Pentagon, which did not immediately respond. The INF Pact bans Russia and the United States from stationing short and intermediate-range land-based missiles in Europe. Washington announced on February 1 it will withdraw from the treaty in 6 months unless Moscow ends its alleged violations. Analyst Kingston Reef of the Arms Control Association think tank said Putin may be seeking to signal that Russia can keep up with the United States, to distract from its internal problems, or to deflect blame for the parlous state of the INF Treaty. He may also be trying to send the message that, look, neither side should want this world of a new arms race, so we should sit down and resume discussions, Reef said. Putin has said he does not want an arms race but would have no choice but to act if Washington deployed new missiles in Europe, some of which he says could strike Moscow within 10 to 12 minutes. The United States does not currently have ground-based intermediate-range nuclear missiles that it could place in Europe. It could develop and deploy them if the INF Treaty collapses. Vladimir Putin, left with Lukashenko, promised to target more missiles at the U.S. if America sends new weapons to Europe. Russia has released video of its Poseidon nuclear-powered underwater drone that can be launched from a submarine and carry nuclear warheads. The clip emerged after Russian President Vladimir Putin said the Poseidon, seen by military officials as a giant nuclear-capable torpedo, had been undergoing successful tests. Putin said his naval response to such a move would mean Russia could strike the United States faster than U.S. missiles deployed in Europe could hit Moscow because the flight time would be shorter. The calculation would not be in their favor, at least as things stand today. That's for sure, said Putin. Relations between Moscow and Washington were strained, he added, but the tensions were not comparable to those of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The tensions, are not a reason to ratchet up confrontation to the levels of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. In any case, that's not what we want, said Putin. If someone wants that, well okay, they are welcome. I have set out today what that would mean. Let them count the missile flight times. Separately, Washington said on Thursday that it was carrying out an observation flight over Russia under the Open Skies Treaty, the first one since 2017. In a statement, the Pentagon said an unarmed OC-135B aircraft was being used in Russia, was aware of the flight. Both the US and the Soviets expected that if they went to war, Europe would be their battleground. By the early 1980s, the US, under Ronald Reagan, was outspending the Soviets in introducing dramatically improved new weapons in the air and on the ground. In particular, the Soviet SS-20 medium-range nuclear missiles, launched from mobile carriers, were seen as the biggest threat to NATO forces if there were to be an exchange of weapons. Nuclear missiles which could match their destructive power were a priority, and the Pershing II was developed, which could destroy underground bunkers and silos and reach Soviet territory in just 6 minutes, making them both undetectable and capable of largely killing off the Soviet ability to respond. But moving the missiles into the places where they would be used in battle created a whole new dimension of conflict for the U.S. its NATO allies, this time with peace protesters who made their deployment the focus of their rage. Target, the land-based nuclear cruise missiles brought to the UK, sparked public protests when they were deployed to the USAF base at Greenham Common west of London in 1983. Women formed a peace camp at Greenham Common from the time it was identified as the host for the cruise and Pershing missiles, and remained there long afterwards. In December 1982, one of their protests was a human chain around its perimeter blocking tactic. Anti-nuclear protesters from the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp tried to stop cruise missiles arriving by stopping access to its main gates. Beginning in 1983, 2 deployments in particular were to become infamous flashpoints. In the UK, the US Air Force Base at Greenham Common, Berkshire, to the west of London, would be used for 160 medium-range nuclear cruise missiles, and a smaller number of Pershing II rockets. RAF Molesworth in Cambridgeshire would receive 64 cruise missiles. In Germany, 3 bases, Neu-Ulm, Mettlangen and Neckarsulm, would receive a total of 108 Pershing IIs. But in both countries, the campaign for nuclear disarmament launched huge and widespread protests. Focus. The Pershing II missile was deployed in 1983 to German bases in the face of huge public anger, with demonstrations of hundreds of thousands who saw it as a threat to West Germany's existence. Cold War welcome. In West Germany there were protests regularly against the missiles and their deployment. They entered active duty in 1983, and by 1987 a deal for their destruction was done in Germany. Mettlangen became the focal point, while in Greenham Common, a peace camp of women against nuclear weapons sprang up at the perimeter. Attempts to move munitions were met with sit-down protests on roads outside. In Bonn, then the capital of West Germany, as many as 400,000 people took part in one anti-Pershing protest, part of a day of demonstrations across Europe, while other protests saw a human chain from U.S. headquarters in Stuttgart to the gates of the Mettlangen. 19A3 also saw one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, when NATO's Able Archer war games, which involved activating troops and giving dummy instructions to fire nuclear weapons, were misunderstood by the Soviets. Soviet threat. An SS-20 preserved in Russia shows the weapon which the Pershing II and cruise missiles were designed to counter. The SS-20 rocket launched multiple warheads and could reach all of Western Europe from Soviet-controlled territory, including East Germany. They thought the exercise was really preparations for a first strike with the new Pershing arsenal, part of the plan. The Soviets ordered its nuclear arsenal to be prepared for action and placed bombers on high alert. If NATO forces under U.S. command had moved to an increased state of readiness, the Soviets could well have launched their own nuclear weapons. Spy Oleg Gordievsky later wrote an account of the tense moments, which ended when Able Archer concluded on November 11, 1983. What peace protesters had not realized was that behind the scenes, the U.S. had made an offer in the late 1970s to the Soviets, that if it agreed to get rid of its SS-20s, the U.S. would withdraw the Pershings and the cruise missiles. By 1986, the Soviet Union was led by Mikhail Gorbachev, and a deal began to take shape. By September 1987, the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in Washington, D.C. It eliminated all the weapons being protested against in the space of 4 years, leaving just a handful of mementos in museums. Now, however, its future appears doomed.